Well, it's a pleasure to see you all today. Thank you for joining us, and an honor to have Jim Bildner with us here today. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, which is a foundation focused on public policy kinds of questions and nonprofit activities. I asked Rip Rapson, whom some you all know, the president of the Kresge Foundation. My mind is still in lunch. In any event, I asked Rip about Jim, and what he told me was that Jim has actually overseen venture capital-like investments in hundreds of social change organizations led by the entrepreneurs of extraordinary ambition and talent. It's likely not a coincidence that the breadth of Jim's interest is mirrored by the breadth of DRK's portfolio: healthcare, education, criminal justice, the arts, the environment, international human rights, and so much more. He is on the board of the Kresge Foundation, and he is also he started his own social investments practice, and he has the added pleasure and duty of being chairman of the investment committee of the Kresge Foundation as well. And you may know that Rip has been down here almost every other year.
Right.
Told us, really kept us posted on the exciting events in Detroit, and the incremental changes that occur steadily over the years. So in any event, as you can see from what Rip Rapson said about Jim, he's dealing with a lot of the issues that many of us are dealing with in our teaching and in our research. And it is a privilege. The record that he has in this field is remarkable and admirable. And so I'm sure there's much for us to learn about it from what he's going to tell us. And the usual format will be, we'll have he's going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and we'll let him go longer if he'd like, but he says he doesn't want to go longer than like. So I'll leave it to you all to come up with some very good questions in which you can pose to him and get his wisdom on your questions. So let's leave it at that. Jim, thank you very much for coming. You're prepared. We prepared for you by all the wonderful things people say about you, and now we're looking forward to hearing from them yourself.
Oof. Can't wait to hear what that guy says.
It's best to use the mic or get closer.
Can you hear me? You can hear me okay, right? Yes. Good, okay. Oh, okay, got it. All right, fine. Okay, good, all right. I hope this will be fundamentally different from what you've heard from before. And the reason why is this really isn't a time in the world to be nuanced or to be too abstract. Everything that you see, everything you read, everything you believe, whether it's fact or not, just portrays a world that has become just incredibly good at creating systemic challenges. And stacked up against that reality is an under-resourced world to tackle them on. And, one of the things that is not in this presentation, but that we sort of use fundamentally, and I teach a course at the Kennedy School around essentially this topic of social impact investing. And one of the sort of grounding frameworks we use for our students is Paul Brest's Big Cube, Small Cube, and I don't know if you've had the opportunity to do it. It's in his Money Well Spent book. Paul actually takes no credit for it, gives it to his research assistant. But fundamentally, this is where, when you look at the size of the problem, and the biggest cube problem you can think of is climate change. I won't cold call and have you go through the agony of trying to figure out what's a big cube problem. Small cube problem would be cleaning the streets in front of this building. Small cube problem all in your own control. not going to really create anything significant. The big, Q problem, not in your control. Tons of codependencies, very small likelihood, sadly, of success in the near or the long term. And so the problems the world's creating is enormously big Q problems, and again, we don't have a whole lot of solutions. I was on a panel 2 weeks ago when the moderator, wanted me to talk about venture philanthropy, and so very quickly I said to her, we're neither venture capitalists nor are we philanthropists, and if there's anything that grounds the work that we've done over 20 years at Draper, Richards, Kaplan, it's the idea that we see the world in its inequities. And we have, from the beginning, and much more intentionally, I'd say over the last 10 years, focused on the front lines of those inequities. And, again, having listened to a whole bunch of the YouTubes that have been done here in these seminars over the years, and mindful of the noise in the system, generally around philanthropy and the agony that many feel about philanthropy, that's of no import to us. That is very much an insider's game. That is very much philanthropists talking to philanthropists. And to be honest, it doesn't create a meal. It doesn't create access to education, doesn't create access to healthcare. And it's very inwardly focused to the detriment of those that are in need. And again, I've been on the Kresge Foundation board for 17 years, not 17 years, but close. And I mean, we've done enormously great things, but it's hard work to be on the front lines. And our model at DRK is very much to find, fund, and support the highest potential, relatively early stage organizations that we can find that are on the ground trying to ameliorate conditions for vulnerable populations. Our work, we've made our 200th investment. Our work, half of it's here domestically centered in the United States, half of it is in either Africa, India, Europe. Primarily, we have offices in Menlo Park, we have offices in Boston, we're opening an office in Dallas, we have an office in Nairobi, an office in The Hague. We have about 41 of us. And our model, just to ground you in that, is fairly unique. We invest in both for-profits and nonprofits. If it's a nonprofit, we're typically investing $100,000 a year for 3 years, and that's on the achievement of milestones over that 3-year period. We never reinvest, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit, so it's a one-time experience, and we condition every grant and every investment in a for-profit with an active board seat, where we are serving as operating partners, not as coming in every quarter and having a show and tell experience. We are actively operating partners with each of our entrepreneurs, and again, in that board role only for 3 years. And we've done 300,000 for the last 20 years, and we'll never change it. And what everybody says when they come to the foundation are really two questions: why only 300,000? And then why only for a 3-year period of time, which are the obvious questions. And the truth is, the secret sauce, money's irrelevant, to be honest. So virtually the majority of our grantees would give us our money back if we would serve on their boards longer, which shows what they value. The fact that we never reinvest again changes the dynamic of the relationship between the leaders and us as funders. There's no incentive for them not to tell us every problem in the universe as quickly as that problem crops up. And I'm happy to say that they do. Quickly, always. And in fact, in our entrepreneurial agreements with our leaders, we require them to have disclosed everything to us, just like somebody in a financial transaction. And it's really designed to signal very early that this is about helping the organization deliver on its mission, and not about you telling us everything that's great. We can't help you if you're just telling us all the things that are great. We can really help you if you tell us the things that are not great. And so that model has had profound consequences, and I'll talk about that. The most important, though, is that we have always looked at our investments every year since we made that investment, and so every year we require all of our grantees and former grantees to give us an update on all of their activities, and it's very specific as to what they're doing. The most important is the direct lives served. And then we have a team internally that looks at those numbers that are delivered and then actually looks at them quite conservatively to try to figure it out. And the sum and substance is that 56% of all the organizations we've ever invested in are directly impacting 10,000 lives or more, 44%, 50,000 lives or more, 25%, 500,000 lives or more, and today a fifth of all, 20%, millions of lives or more. And for a little organization that through essentially 2021 has deployed 110 million plus or minus, that aggregates up to 273 million direct lives impacted. And that's a powerful statement of activity, all because of that operating partner service. That is the core element of it. And what's important about that is the pattern recognition that's taken place over 200 investments. And when we complete our fourth fund, before we begin our fifth fund, we'll have invested in another 80 to 100 organizations. So we'll have continued pattern recognition over a long period of time, which positions our managing directors, who are the folks that are serving on these boards, to recognize early on what the likely consequences of facts that are being provided to them, whether it's a cash runway that's less than 3 months or an opportunistic decision to go into an area that's not a core competency of the organization and therefore they don't have the competency to do it, or a failure today, which we see over and over again in not hiring the right talent at the right time to do the right things, because a lot of noise in the system that is sort of fed early stage organizations is around minimum viable product, lean and mean, and when you're stacked up against the kind of challenges that our folks are trying to deal with, which is every complicated problem on the planet, the last thing you need is lean and mean. The last thing you need is lack of capacity. And so they actually need the most talented folks, not the least. They need to pay whatever it takes to get talent into the marketplace for them. And so working across those lines at an operating level is what really has made a difference for us. So that's our model, and I can take lots of questions on that, but I think I'll go through, I'm not going to flip these slides. I know what the slides are, and I can talk to them. So, if you want me to, I can help. The slides are subject to a copyright, so I can't actually distribute them, but let's see how you do without seeing the visual slide. So the first slide would say that scaling today is fundamentally different than at any other time. And I think Cassie sent out the Stanford Social Innovation Review article that we published a week and a half ago or so, which laid out, in essence, the framework itself. 10 years ago, the world was in love with disruption. And then there was a lot of noise in the system that philanthropy only liked the latest shining thing, and ignored the long-term, more mature organizations to their detriment, and instead focused in on new things that could come and disrupt the system. And then in addition to that, this idea that you could change policy from the top. And so there are lots of examples why the latter doesn't work any longer. The easiest one is the Smart on Crime initiatives that took place all the way through 2016, where hundreds of millions of dollars and tons of time that actually resulted in a policy shift to reform prosecutorial behavior and sentencing and charging was wiped out in a minute. And that was when consensus was possible that you could get it through. Today, you can't get anything through. And we see organization after organization after organization who has pinned their mission on being able to create some macro policy change, and that fundamentally doesn't come along, and therefore that mission is gonzo. And so and then disruption. So the world is really good at stop energy. You can get a lot of people to go out on the streets and try to stop something. It's very hard to get that same behavior to start something. And so stop energy, lots of great examples of stop energy, very few examples today of the start energy that fundamentally leads to fundamental change. And so the inability to get adoption of disruptive social movements in combo with the inability to drive new policy change from the top has led us to have a hypothesis, which when we applied it to our own portfolio and looked at the 30 most impactful portfolios we had, proved something that we were really surprised about. So those organizations that had the most impact in our portfolio of late, over the last 6 to 7 years, were organizations that didn't primarily try to disrupt and didn't primarily rely on federal or macro state policy change, but instead worked on systems that existed and recognized at that time that the fact that those systems existed but were imperfect was not a reason to ignore them. And by utilizing those systems in place, the distribution channels, the infrastructure, and by improving the linkages in those systems, they were able to create enormous change and mitigated the fundamental risk that takes place when you are trying to create new infrastructure, which is operational risk. One of the sort of axioms of creating systemic change is that execution is 100% of the battle. You cannot create change if you can't operate or execute against the plan. So those elements and that framework proved out, at least in our data, and I suspect it will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So that's the fundamental message in a change of scale, which is don't look at what's not there, look at what is there, and then spend a lot of time identifying what that system was created for in the beginning, what happened to those people, and then try to figure out the linkages. And that leads to the methodology. So the tactics of deploying this framework are all around understanding the problem itself. So the other thing we've learned over time is that the kind of organizations that we're looking for know the problem. In many cases, they're proximate to it. They've experienced it. But they assume the problem's genesis is something it's not. And so they don't do what we would call a full-scale landscape ecosystem that looks at the kinds of problems that they're dealing with. And I'll show you a series of criminal justice slides in a few seconds, because I think that does help visually to help take what would be a very simple problem, and maybe we can do that now if this works. Let's see, is it this one, or what's the button I'm supposed to use for the slide?
3 o'clock.
3, yeah, I got it.
Mine's this way.
I'm hitting 3 o'clock, I guarantee you.
Did you do that? Okay, so yes, right.
Yep. Okay, good. Got it. All right, so let's go to this. So this is a depiction, highly simplified, of the criminal justice system in the United States at a point in time. And, it says what many people consider to be the criminal justice system. There's an investigation, there's an arrest, there's a prosecution, there's a resolution, there's sentencing, correction, and reentry. Seems pretty complete, right? But then take another look at it, like who is driving the decision-making? So now you have complexity as to who's actually deciding what to investigate, who's doing the investigation, who's making the arrest decisions, who's deciding what the prosecution is, and how is that resolution being taken place. There are enormously significance in how that resolution takes place. Then what is the sentencing? What's the reentry? Who's going to help? So a little more complicated. And then think about it from this way, like what decision-making is driving that policy? What are those policies? And how do they separate? And I won't go through all of the depiction here, but you can see that it takes that initial straight line and now makes it incredibly complicated. And if you followed every one of those paths, there's some dependency or codependency or intervention or co-intervention that would change the outcome at almost every level. And then what are the collateral consequences of this? and what happens, and how does this system actually operate. And we could go on and on and on, making it even more complicated. And it's really, when you're thinking about a problem, you have to think about it from the individual who is facing the problem. It's almost irrelevant if you're not focused on that, because that's the person that's experiencing the problem. And so when you do that at every step, that's when you figure out all these other lines. Because it's not some system that's somehow raining on an individual. It's hundreds of people with different agencies and different authority, and they're not operating holistically to try to solve the problem. And so that led us to like, okay, so how would you solve for that? And so at DRK, we had for many, many years been trying to have interventions in a number of different places, but based on this and based on our experience in 2017, our net conclusion for the criminal justice system was to only play in two places. One, to try to keep people from getting into the system to begin with, and the other is once they're released to prevent them from getting back in the system. And it turned out for us, if those are the only two areas that we spend our time and energy and are reasonably successful, all the rest of the craziness that takes place in the middle is irrelevant. If people aren't in the system, they're not in the system. So charging decisions, sentencing decisions, not really material. If they get out of the system and don't go back, not relevant as well. And so I raise that and I take you through this analysis, and we're doing this in every area we're involved in to be able to have the same understanding of what can we actually do. And remember, this is that right sizing that I was talking about, big cube, small cube. So again, looking at our available capital. But honestly, it doesn't really matter. You could take $2 billion and dump it into the system, and you should come out to the same conclusion. Like all that money should be spent keeping people out or getting them out and keeping them from going back in. Capital is not the constraint to the solution. It's all those codependencies in the slides before that. And so understanding early what the problem is and then what surrounds the problem allows you to do a number of things. One is to devise solutions that can stick. So again, keeping people out, they're out. Keeping them from getting back in, they're out. It doesn't really matter what federal policy is. The other is it allows you to direct your resources to those activities that have the highest potential for creating change. And that, in a nutshell, sort of is probably the most significant tactic. So the framework is straightforward: focus on existing infrastructure and distribution channels, focus in on creating the linkages that they fail to do. So many of the systems that we work on, we DRK work on, are systems that were put in place to provide those that are eligible for healthcare benefits to get those benefits. The reality is there are 20 million people who are entitled to benefits and don't have benefits. The reality is that there are enough healthcare providers that are required by statute to provide those benefits and want to provide those benefits, but just don't know where the people are. The systems that were created to bring those populations together expected people to be in places they're not and won't be. They are in different communities, they're in different life experiences. And so the interventions that we're working on, as we indicated in the article, are places where those linkages can actually be made. And so they're going into communities where people are. They're going to food pantries, they're going to laundromats, they're going to other community centers, and working with folks to identify their data with their consent, and then matching it against the providers who are required to provide the benefit, who, by the way, are incented to provide that benefit by the very same systems that require them to provide it. And the test then, the linkages are made, and now it's how sticky those will be. How persistent will those linkages be? And that's still another level of intervention. But there's already the funding for the providers to provide the service. There's already the funding for those that can't pay for it to get the service, so it's just a linkage question. And that was true with Education Superhighway that connected 47 million kids in their schools pre-pandemic to internet. $3 billion was sitting in E-rate, and the real challenge was just to get the infrastructure there. Funding was already there, which is rare. And what was the core constraint in making that happen? The state government didn't have the operating skills to do it. nor did they have the mandate to do so. Now, Education Superhighway moving on to their second version, recognized, well, it's great to have 47 million kids connected in school, but when they're not in school, that didn't help at all. And then they realized that there was an affordability issue for where infrastructure already existed. So there's roughly 20 to 25 million people who do not have internet access, not because there's no infrastructure, but because they can't afford it. So the infrastructure is there, they just can't afford it. And now Education Superhighway is trying to solve for the affordability gap. Again, looking at the system that exists and then finding what the binding constraint is and not having to recreate the infrastructure. So that is the core element of what we've learned over these investments. Let's see. Great. That's a half hour. So happy to take any questions on our model, what we think. Ask me anything about any, yeah, sure.
Help me with the logic of this picture. So the solution is don't touch anything inside the criminal justice system, only try to keep people out, and then once they get out, do something. That's be like in the health system, don't worry about what's happening in the hospitals or in doctor's offices. Try to keep people healthy, and then when they get out, give them rehab. It can't be that simple. So,
yeah, no, it can actually be that simple. So part of it is who's the actor trying to create the change. And so we know what our pay grade is. So the person who would otherwise be caught up in the criminal justice system, frankly, doesn't care. All the efforts at a federal sentencing guideline or a framework, they just care not to get into that system. And I know with certainty if we can create that change for that person, one person is improved. And I think it's the lens. So I'm not saying everybody in the planet should focus in on the individual, but I'm saying that not enough people do. And there's a lot of research and a lot of activity that is focusing on policy change. And to be honest, if you take, let's use your healthcare system. I mean, the healthcare system has massive challenges despite 50 years of activity trying to improve it. There's all kinds of issues in equity and actually you can't really talk to anybody today at any part of the system. Are you going to give us like flashlights?
Apologies.
You can't talk to anybody in the system who actually feels like all the work that's been done has really solved whatever issue. So doctors are not happy, hospital systems are not happy, the individuals are not happy. So it's not all or nothing. I just know that with our capital, let me put it this way. I know if I can create a better situation for 270 million people, that's pretty good.
So it's more, you're saying, given a limited amount of capital, that's where you're going to spend. You're not going to try to go inside and try to fix the discretion of prosecutors or how pleas are done. Your money is better spent on both sides. Is that really?
Well, I would actually. So, the answer is for sure for us.
Oh, okay.
But I also think it's for others as well. I don't think you can make the case that all the money that's been spent historically on sentencing reform and on prosecutorial judgment has really paid off. And I'd love to have that conversation with you. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, but yeah.
So what do you spend your money on to prevent people from getting into this criminal justice system in the first place?
Yeah, so we've invested in a ton of organizations that are working on the obvious things, violence reduction, folks that are already implicated at some level in the criminal justice system without them getting charged. So there's lots of places in that one of those earlier charges where there's exits, ramps off of that. So we're working to bolster those. The area where there's the most opportunity set is on the returning citizens, which historically have had almost no resources, and because of the way they're returned, usually without capital, usually without outstanding fines, no prospects for jobs, no opportunity, they're almost certainly going back. And so that is an area that is particularly ripe with opportunity to help those folks. So we've heavily invested there. And then recidivism, which is in our portfolio, has unbelievable data, as you might have read through the article. And that data is being used for departments of correction who are charged with executing against their mission but lack the data. So by letting them know the population of folks they have, which is using their own data but analyzing it in a way that can be used, they're able to execute their own agency in a way to release people that are entitled to be released when they're able to be released. And it's not always because these systems want to keep people in. It's often they just don't have the data or the resources to do it. So that's an organization that said, okay, this is the existing infrastructure. I have willing actors who will act if I can get them their data, and so we'll provide that to them. And so those are real opportunities to change. And again, every person who is responsible for some philanthropic effort has to make a judgment as to what is capable within their scale. And again, to your question, I don't really think it matters a ton whether you have an endowment that's 16 billion, 4 billion, a couple $100 million, 50 million. The size of the problems that are in front of us are not going to be solved by $150 billion. They're just not, because they're not in the first instance suffering from lack of capital. They're suffering in the first instance from a lack of consensus on what should happen with these kinds of challenges. There was an article, I don't know, must have been 15 years ago, I've been looking for it in the Time magazine back in one of the bubble days, where they looked at the wealthiest individuals who had trillions of dollars and like, hey, if we could just put $2 trillion out there, we'd cure poverty. I don't think that's true either. To me, it's not capital limitation.
What do you say to somebody who says you're stalked by crime and going to keep up with police?
Well, let's see. So that's a political question.
But that's,
Yeah.
not me, but somebody could see that slide and say, oh, I get it, you're one of those people who wants.
So Renee Hall, who's the former deputy police chief in Detroit and then the former police chief in Dallas, is working with two other folks, and she's an African-American former police chief, so she's uniquely positioned to understand the challenges. Dallas was a pretty challenged place post George Floyd. And so her solution to the answer is it's not about defunding or funding. It's about getting getting a new population of people in roles of authority in the police department. So they're trying to create, its early days, sort of a Naval Academy equivalent to be able to get a different population of folks to enter into the system. And I do think that's the better argument between funding or not funding. Again, I don't think it's a capital issue. It really is a question of who are we sending out in the first instance to respond to the kinds of calls that are coming in. I mean, to be a dispatcher or be responsible for dispatching, you're not getting a lot of information. You're getting an incident, and you have a deployment force, but are they trained in mental health? The kid that was just killed eating a cheeseburger. I mean, that's just one example of, after another. And so, again, I'm not a criminal justice expert, but I for sure believe that we're not deploying the right resources at the right time all the time.
Have you ever ridden with law enforcement?
I have.
Yeah.
Yep.
And yeah, I'd like to study that a little bit more. I spent 20 years in the criminal justice system as a prosecutor and defense attorney before I went to Kennedy School. And one quick thing I noticed up there on that you didn't include in there was the juvenile justice system.
It's depicted
It's not linked into that at all. And the opportunity to intervene both within the lives of the kids that come into the juvenile justice center, but also within the lives of the families.
totally. Family law court. There's the diversion paths are significant in terms of, and as you know better than most, it's jurisdictionally dependent. Not every state has all these.
But we spent 20 plus years ago, we were trying to move the age out of the juvenile court up to age 18 to match the science. And they've only, in North Carolina, they've only recently passed legislation for most offenses. We still have certain categories of offenses in which someone under the age of 18 can be bound over to the Superior Court and be treated as an adult. And a lot of that system is driven by stories.
Yep.
Not necessarily by data.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Zagbayu. Pleasure to meet you. This was fascinating. Hi, David. Good to see you. I have two questions. The first, I really appreciate your acknowledgement that the people who are experiencing the problems know most about the issues. So I'm curious about what is the engagement of the people you are hoping to support in even the imagination or understanding of what the problems are. That's one. And then my second question, I want to understand, I'm so curious about your staff members being managing partners. Is that how you describe them?
Managing directors.
Managing directors. If my imagination serves me well, it's almost like an in-house consultant for the institution that they're working with, someone who's helping them make sense of data, maybe give them feedback about what are the blind spots of the institution itself. And I'm just curious, in the weeds, what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
And where might there be tension points? The model sounds fascinating. I used to be an executive director, so I'm just imagining someone who's given us money now with an in-house managing director on our board, what that dynamic might have actually
Let's
meant.
deal with the second question first, and then I'll
Sure.
come back to the other one for sure. So number one, this is a voluntary act. So in the find function, when our team is looking for organizations that, in our view, have the potential to have a minimum impact of 10,000 direct lives in 3 to 7 years following our investment, we're looking at a couple, well, actually 6 things in particular. One, what's the problem? And what's our understanding of the ecosystem surrounding the problem? What's the solution? And how sustainable, and by that we mean how sticky will that solution be? So if it's a nonprofit, will they be able to attract philanthropic capital long enough to be able to create sustainability if they have a fee-for-service model? Or if they never will there be sufficient philanthropy to enable them to accomplish their mission? And that's a very high bar. If they're a for-profit, philanthropy's purpose is for-profit, and most of us are making these under program-related investment rules, Section 182 of the code. We can't displace market capital. So by definition, these organizations that have chosen to be for-profit and are unable currently to attract market capital. But ultimately, if they're a for-profit, they're going to need to be able to do that. Then the team itself, and this gets to both of your questions. So today we're looking for teams that are proximate, so understand the problem completely, maybe from the neighborhood, may not be, but have some proximity, some direct proximity to the problem. And therefore, in the first instance, have a very clear view of not only themselves, but others that they're trying to help. And virtually every one of them has a powerful, authentic story to tell about the problem, why they came to the problem, and how they're addressing the problem, and what the feedback loop is on that. So it's not an abstract, human-centric design process. It's a very direct understanding, and we're spending a lot of time trying to understand that as well. So when we are talking to folks around that organization, we're talking to folks who are beneficiaries of it and trying to understand it. And then finally, and most importantly for us, is like, where can we add value, which gets to your second question that I'm answering first. And we do a lot of work with our entrepreneurs up front to make sure they know what they're getting. I mean, we're going to spend 3 intense years with them. We need to make sure that they're up for it and that they understand that our fidelity is to the mission, it's not to them. You know, it's about the organization. Very early in our careers, we had something called a DRK Fellow, which was the entrepreneur themselves. And the messaging from them was it's about you, the entrepreneur, and about your entrepreneurial behavior. We've changed that and made it's about the organization itself. So our fidelity is to the mission. And, you know, the vast majority of the time, there's alignment between the leader and the leaders and the mission, but not always. And that is when the rubber hits the road. But our fidelity is always to the social hypothesis that we invested in, that you told us you were going to help these people. And therefore, when we see these organizations getting off track, not because they're intentionally trying to do it, but because they're likely to do it because they're going to lack the resources to do it, we're trying to put them back on track and helping them understand. And our managing directors all have operating experience. That's the number one thing we're looking for. People who have operated, we've all made a ton of mistakes. We've all had some successes. And the number one criteria for someone who's going to be successful with us is they've made the conversion from it's about them to it's about others. So you don't see, you know, DRK all over the place. You don't see our brand being, you know, whatever. But you see our portfolio organizations. They've won 31% of our portfolio has won either the Audacious Prize, gotten a Mackenzie Scott gift out of the sky, Scola awardee, Brofman awardee. So it's all about them. And that's just validation of impact. So I think that answered it. And then we'd also talk to the other board members too. Now these boards are generally pretty early in their career development. And so, and they're often populated by friends and family and mentors and professors. And so we spend a lot of time like, hey, by the way, we're going to be an operating partner here. And we're going to speak our mind and, you know, might be uncomfortable for you, might be uncomfortable for us, but that's how we can help you. And again, we just had our annual retreat, September 6th through 8th. All of our current portfolio is required to come, but 50 of our alumni portfolio who are not required to come came. And that gives you sort of a sense of what that means. And you didn't ask it, but it's in your question, which is you were focused, I think, appropriately as well on the power dynamic, right? You're running the organization. You got these, you know, an operating partner with a big set of opinions, but really where our energy and efforts are to make our entrepreneurs understand and feel that they're not alone. And we actually interviewed a bunch of them at this retreat, and eventually we'll get a reel out of it, and I'll send it around if you're interested. But one after another, after another, after another, after another said they felt a sense of belonging. And it wasn't because of us, it was because they were in a room with 100 other people trying to solve really complicated problems in conflict zones, under-resourced, being told all the time, no, 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 no. And that's the value. So it's because, and that's why we don't reinvest, because when, you know, an organization thinks that they can get more money, and the funder thinks that there's some dynamic there because they can give money, it's complicating, and it's not a healthy dynamic. What is healthy is like, we believe in you. And so, you know, let us help you as much as we can in real time when you can. And there's no downside for bringing problems, only upside. Does that answer your question? Okay, good.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what if a philanthropy-funded nonprofit comes up with a solution that turns out to be radical and vastly different from the funders' like values, you know, because we all have different ideas of how to solve certain problems. And what if, you know, a nonprofit comes up with a bunch of solutions that are a bit more radical than a funder would like?
Well, so in our case, we're diligencing whatever is brought to us. So whatever the radical solution is, we're looking at it before we invest. not to, so its radicalness is not the issue for us. Its ability to actually succeed is the issue for us. I mean, you could probably give me an example that would be more specific, but we're not, radical or not radical is not a phrase that I really think of in that term. So I'll give you another example. I was on a panel again a couple of weeks ago with one of our entrepreneurs, Wawira from Food for Education. And she was talking to this group of a couple hundred people and said, you know, what I liked about DRK is they didn't tell me I couldn't do something. This is to your question, actually. And so Wawira wanted to do an extension of her model that, truthfully, we didn't think would work. And we told her, like, we're not sure this thing is going to work, but we let her do it. And then she came back to us and said, you know, it didn't work. But thank you for letting me try it. And that's the kind of relationship we have to have. I mean, we're not operating these things. It's not our decision. We're there to support. And that trust relationship is built on that understanding. We're not making the decision of whether hire or fire this person or whether you should do this or that. We will say, hey, you know, we've done 100 of these or 200 of these, and, you know, based on what you've told me, I'd worry about this. And by the way, go talk to 25 other people who've just been through it, which is the value of the community. So it doesn't have to be my opinion or any one of our managing directors. I think I do know what you're talking about, you know, from a funder dynamic. But our hope, and again, I'm sure we're not perfect, is in the areas we care about, which are the fundamentals of basic access to what I think anybody in this room would consider to be just unquestionably what people deserve. Anything that can get there is fair game to us.
I think he was first. David.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this. I'm intrigued and in places baffled. So the metric you mentioned of direct lives affected is very powerful. But my question is, some of these systems continue to replicate unfavorable outcomes. So what is the feedback mechanism? Can you give us some examples of how the innovators working on direct lives affected have then moved to shape how systems behave differently over time? Because I was a trustee at Public Welfare Foundation, which dealt with criminal justice, and we kept being dispirited by the machine that was outpacing what we could do. So I'm interested in the feedback loop and how you think about that metric of getting dysfunctional, harmful systems also to change their outcomes. Thank you.
And in full disclosure, in 2016 or 17, I penned an article with Vanessa Kirsch and Jeff Walker on systems change, which at that time articulated disruption, you know, as a means of creating change. And so, and we also, I'm digressing for a purpose, I hope. So we looked at how to measure impact over almost all 20 years of our existence. In the beginning, the first 10 years, we measured it in very venture capital-like things. CAGR, the annual growth rate of our enterprises from their funding proxy. So we were early stage funders. The average was 286,000. 3 years later, they have a budget of 3 million. Our CAGR rates are off the charts, but the impact was nominal. Like, funding is not a proxy for results. So that was lesson number one. Lesson number two is we spent a lot of time on the spider charts, looking at depth and breadth and using time as a fulcrum for change. And to be honest, that was incredibly complicated, and very few people understood it. And it turned out not to be very useful in translation to when people asked us, what's your impact? That led us to this 10,000 lives or more. So I'll stipulate that an organization that's directly impacting 10,000 lives or more is helpful, but are they going to completely undermine a bad system? No. What I'll stipulate as well is that the organizations of ours that are directly impacting millions of lives have in fact changed the system. So Muso in Mali has had its health practices adopted completely. Sanergy is well on its way to creating sanitation systems and utilities in sub-Saharan Africa. Education superhighway, clear example, got the federal government to adopt the broadband extension, and that system, which was under the control of the FCC all before that, has been changed profoundly forever. And so our point of view is that at some point in time, critical mass becomes undeniable. And, Marshall Gantz, who I'm sure you know or have read, had a powerful statement that the role of social movements is to show communities what's possible so that they demand more. The natural extension of that theory is that their lives are changed at a scale that cannot be undone politically. And so my answer to your question is, if you're targeting for millions of lives, that becomes it's possible to be undone, but it's really hard, particularly if it's concentrated, because the political agency is concentrated as well. So that's my answer to that question. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for taking time today. I had two questions. First is, what does your portfolio look like going into each year, as in how much of the nonprofits do you invest in versus for-profits? I know that you'll have to manage your return on investment as well to your stakeholders to make the impact investment. My second question is, having worked in system thinking framework to try to push student learning outcomes in rural India, I'm just curious because whenever we had our intervention for a couple of years, it seems to work. But when the funding is out, when the NGO is out, that progress doesn't seem to continue. This comes back again and again through RCTs or any way they test. So I'm just curious as to, do you think your approach is sustainable? If so, how?
Yeah, so the first question was one of, what's the percentage of nonprofits versus for-profits? And today, in any given year, we're probably funding 60% that are nonprofit and 40% that are for-profit. Again, those for-profits, we're doing exclusively under program-related investment rules. And I think the second question was it specific to India?
I mean, I was just taking an example of India, but just to understand when you count lives as impacted, are they sustainable or are they done when your intervention or your investment is out?
Right. So we're measuring every year, every organization we funded. And so we're adding and deleting as that takes place. But the truth is that of the 200 organizations today, roughly 170 plus or minus are active. Now that's over a long period of time. The vast majority are younger. So let's take education superhighway just because it's easy. If you've connected 47 million schools to broadband, they're connected. And it's very unlikely somebody's going to snip 47 million wires, so that's done. Many of the organizations we're funding today are addressing similar problems at similar scale. And so when the problem is done, it's done. But the half of the portfolio, or the 44% today that are not impacting 10,000 lives or more, are not going to be persistent in all likelihood. And that's to be expected. And again, to David's question, persistency, stickiness, and adoption all have the same genetic parent, and that is scale. So if you are, Nudge is in our portfolio, People is in our portfolio, Rocket Learning is in our portfolio, they are the number of people impacted and that have been impacted over a long period of time are in the millions. Now the population is, in the billions, so that's a different thing. But in most of those cases, they're working directly with India state actors in adoption, both in education and depending on their agency.
We have a question from our Zoom
Sure.
participants.
Joe asked, if capital isn't true constraint and trying to change the underlying macro policy isn't necessarily effective, is the goal really just to put capital to work in as many spots as possible that improve these linkages quickly?
I think the answer to that, well, the two hypotheses, if capital is not a problem, and the other one was what? Oh, that you can't make the change from the top down.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Well, our belief is to concentrate capital on the front lines of these problem sets, but not like seeds on a field of dirt, but to do it in an intentional way where we know that we can see the kind of direct impact that can be established. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Hannah Ford. I work at the Mellon Foundation, and I'm working with Carter Stewart, one of
great. Good.
DRK's former managing directors, on a group of grants right now. So thank you so much for being here today. I had
And Carter will recognize those criminal justice slides.
Yes, yes. And I also, to your question earlier about organizations presenting risky solutions, I have talked with Carter about the due diligence process that DRK goes through, and it's quite extensive.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit more on so once you've made the grant, you have somebody who's sitting as a managing director on the board. We're having this challenge at Mellon right now. We have 18 staff. We have 600 active grants, right? We couldn't do something like that. What else could we do, or what else do you think philanthropy can do, aside from having somebody who's actively sitting on the board? Or maybe that's the model, and that's why you all have chosen that. So that way we can continue to support the leaders that we believe in and the missions we believe in. I just would love to hear a little bit more about your thinking on that.
Yeah, so I'll use Kresge as an example because I've had a front seat to it. Some of the most extraordinary impact we've had has been using other tools in our, quote, toolbox, if you will. So in 2008, we started our social investment program, and it was really a board-generated effort. Again, in those days, as you know, the financial crisis was making the receivables for frontline health and human service agencies nearly uncollectible because the government couldn't pay them in time. And so our first foray was to put out $5 million to 20 different social service agencies. And they all were loans. They all were due with quarterly payments at 0% interest over a 3-year period of time. And all of them helped preserve the amount of services that were being provided, and we collected 98.5% back. And that was recycled capital, small amount of capital. But it opened our eyes to what was possible. We really hadn't done program-related investments before. Today, Aaron Siebert runs the practice, and we have hundreds of millions of dollars of program-related investments, either in loan guarantees, in all kinds of complicated ways. And what it enables Kresge to do, and we're not the only one that does it, Gates does it, others do it, but today we're actually one of the biggest players, is match need with resource. And so it enables Kresge and enables us to match the entity that's coming to us, and in the first instance for the capital source, figure out what they need. And we see often nonprofits coming in our door that should be for-profits, and we see for-profits that for sure should be nonprofits. And we spend a lot of time with them trying to understand have they picked the right entity formation. Now that doesn't necessarily help your question with Mellon. You don't have enough human resources. And some of the areas that you're active in, particularly arts and culture, don't necessarily lend themselves to the kind of operating partners that you have. But thank God you guys are still in arts and culture, because the world desperately needs arts and cultural organizations, which it does not value very much. You're one of the last funders out there. But these other tools can be very useful, particularly in the arts and culture context. there was, this is a massive digression, so maybe we should do it offline, but you know Carol's work, University of Chicago, that looked at all building permits put forward in a 20-year period of time that built performing arts centers across communities across the United States. And the net result of that was the vast majority of them were no longer doing arts and culture, were repurposed buildings because they could build the buildings, but they didn't sustain the buildings themselves. And the hypothesis is we build this great performing arts center, then we'll have this great local talent with a place to perform. And it turned out that the economics of the performing arts center required national reps to come in, which drove out local talent. So, you got to be careful with your capital. But anyhow, I know. It did, yeah. Susan was there when the head of the NEA debriefed us. Yeah, it was great.
Ryan.
So I have to say, this has been one of the most interactive FIRGs I've watched. I think I've either watched or attended over 50, and I think you have the record for the shortest presentation, but the most engaging question and answer. It's been awesome.
Good.
I have 5 questions, but I'm only going to ask 2. One, the diagram was amazing. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the actual development of it. How did you get there? What was the process? And the second one, being based in Menlo Park, I'm interested in how you've seen technology influence scaling social change since you all have been in business.
Yeah, so the landscape, so there's no programming for it. You can't just Google, show me the criminal justice system. Well, you will get something, but, so when Carter was the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio. So when I hired Carter, the first thing I wanted him to do is to convene and bring to us as many other U.S. attorneys, as many other police chiefs, as many other attorney generals as we could. And we sat down with them for what turned out to be 2 days to try to understand better what they saw as the fundamental problems and where they failed and where they succeeded. And that led us, and then we went on further downstream, and then we began to develop these things. And admittedly, maybe I'm sure we're missing some things, but it gave us a window that was at least undisputable for our activities. And we had our own experiences of where we had done other things that were not so successful. And that's the same process. So we've convened human service agencies, we've convened other organizations in other fields for the same purpose. We've actually now utilized more of an RFP-like process to describe kind of what we're imagining. So we imagine an organization, for instance, we can all agree we have a homeless problem in almost every city in the country, if not every city in the country. And we have Airbnb. So we have these 2 facts, a bunch of homeless folks and technology, and this gets to your other question, that is able instantly to tell you where you can stay, for how much you can stay, and arrange both sides of the transaction. Why don't we have a similar technology available for caseworkers and folks who are responsible for homeless folks, who can tell them there's a room for you, and it's 15 minutes away, and there's a bus that's coming by, and here's a ticket for that bus, and your room is reserved, but you have to show up. But we don't. So we are now trying to imagine that. We created a pitch deck out of imagination to be able to put it into the world and see if we can find it. To your question on technology, almost every organization that we have that is at some scale is utilizing technology as an enabler, not as the thing, but as the enabler. And often they're not creating it. They're actually repurposing text messaging or some off-the-shelf technology to enable them to be able to reach the audience that they need and the beneficiaries that they need. And for those that are repurposing existing technology, they don't have the execution failure of developing themselves. Almost the vast majority of organizations that try to develop de novo their own technology, and they all believe, like, we really understand this problem, we can really create this technology, and it's a real challenge, and very few succeed, and they often wildly underestimate the cost and the time.
So I was curious how you try to balance the for-profit, not-for-profit parts of your organization, specifically in the context of your funding, which is what I was trying to look up, hence the interruption. Sorry about that earlier. And also just in the context of the opportunity cost of, say, for example, giving money to a philanthropic organization that could go into like a self-reproducing for-profit institution.
Okay, so I'm not sure I understood the second part, but so we're not balancing. We're not saying, okay, we can only do 40% or for-profits and 60. We're open to buy for the highest potential, relatively early stage organizations that have a meaningful shot at directly impacting 10,000 lives or more in an area where there is a vulnerable population that needs help now. The fact that the organization comes to us as a for-profit or a nonprofit is a decision they've made as to an entity formation. And then it's up to us to figure out if that entity formation is the right one. But it would probably never happen, but we could do 70% for-profit in 1 year and 30% nonprofit. And the biggest thing that shifted is the market has shifted. So 10 years ago, you didn't see any for-profits for the most part that had a social mission. And today, we see a ton of them. Some should be, some shouldn't be, but it's irrelevant to us what the choice is. What's relevant to us is that choice the right choice to attract the kind of capital. So there's no magic thing we're trying to manage our portfolio to. The opportunity cost, I'm not sure what that question is, but go ahead.
So I guess I was more focusing on, so you've got a certain amount of funding, right? I'm not sure if it's coming from an endowment or from investors.
So let me answer that question first. We do not have an endowment. We basically go to market every 3 or 4 years with our results, and we raise capital in essentially tranches. So we have about 80 donors who contribute roughly $1 million a year over 4 years, and we're a public charity. So all of our capital is coming in, all to be deployed, and any for-profits that returns we get go back in and are just recycled. And we've made roughly 33 for-profit investments. We've deployed a little under 6 million. We've recovered about 2 million of that, and we expect to recover our principal back. And those organizations have the same direct impact that our nonprofits do. And you didn't ask this question, but often the biggest challenge that institutional foundations have when they begin to even think about making program-related investments is the program officers themselves. And we had this experience at Kresge where they're like, oh, this is really complicated. Like, I could never do this work. And then you spend time and have them actually understand, like, if you're making a grant to a nonprofit, you're asking identical questions as if you're making an investment in a for-profit. And today, our program team at Kresge is probably one of the most adept at figuring out which tool is the right tool and are the biggest proponents of having these additional tools available to them.
Hi, me again.
Yeah. Hi, you again.
I have a question about teaching. So I'm really appreciated your focus on people. I think I'm new to the School of Public Policy. The students who come in my classroom are brilliant and often focus on the macro, focus on the policy, and the people are like somewhere in the ether. And spend a lot of time in class talking about small is a unit of transformation, the need for relationships. This is about people. Policies are about people. I'm curious about how do you help your students see the link between the people who have real lives today and the policy, and see their relationship in ways that right-size it for the people to be the most important thing and not the policy.
All right, so with my Kennedy School hat, is that what you're asking me?
Or whatever hat.
Yeah.
All your hats. I'm sure they all are useful.
Yeah, so my experience with our students is that they're starting with the people they care about. So they're super grounded in the problems they're working, and there's, you know, I'm sure like yours, they're incredibly diverse and international. And so the challenge is never getting them to try to focus on the people. They're completely focused on that. The areas that we try to help is on the unit of measurement and the ability to figure out what kind of resources you need. Yeah, but they're incredible. So that is not an issue. And, you know, I mean, basically, we're so lucky to have that kind of scale of humans who voluntarily choose to try to enter a program to try to help other people. That is, so we're like giving them standing ovations because we need a whole lot more of them.
So having spent 25 years in the private sector before I spent 30 years at Duke,
Yep.
I'm intrigued by your work and your model. And I have a personal question.
Sure.
And it could be 5, but I'll make it 1 question.
Okay,
But I'm
no
sitting
problem.
here thinking about, gosh, what fascinates him, and what is fun for him, and what is exciting to him. And because there's so much going on here, and so the question is, when you think about the last month or two, and then the next month or two, how do you define, what language do you use to define how you jump out of bed every morning?
Yeah, so that one's easy. So for the last several years, I write a note to my senior partners. And the end of that letter always says the same thing, which is it's been the privilege of my life to do this work. And again, to my preamble in the beginning, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have the ability to help another person, for real, in the world that we're living today. And so I have no trouble getting out of bed and I mean, to not only want to help somebody, but to be able to do that, and then to spend your days in a not just intellectual wonder, but to meet so many people trying to address so many issues in so many different places, and yet they share this common attribute that we saw again and again, and we see it every time in our annual retreat, which is the core characteristic that they share about their lives is they see inequity and they won't walk away from it. You know, and I tell my students at the Kennedy School, like, you know, all these problems you're raising, they're incredible and they're profound. Just go 2 blocks outside of this building in Cambridge and you'll see every single one of them. And that's true. If you go out, you might have to go a little bit longer to get to a city, to some semblance of city, but it's all over here. And, you know, Paul Farmer's biggest fear was that he was worried, appropriately, that we have normalized scarcity. And that's, I mean, institutional failure and all those things are derivative of the normalization of scarcity. So when you begin to see inequity and consider it either normal or not your hunt, everything else fails. And so to be in a position to not normalize it is kind of where I'm at.
May I ask a second question?
Sure.
You've said a magic word 3 times, which was inequity, which is the derivative, I guess, of equity. In the last week, I've been told 3 times by people in philanthropy, in social change, the word equity is the 3rd rail. It cannot be mentioned because there is such a fierce sense on the other side that problems we see are due to personal failure rather than systemic dysfunction. And I was given an article, 2 articles by our dear friend George Will, in which he says, really to talk about structural inequity downplays the role of personal initiative, et cetera, et cetera. So you are in a position where you have the ear of people, I presume. How do you, through the experience of your work, make the contrary argument that in fact we have the inequities we see are not the result of personal behavior, but are structural in their nature, and therefore, and those structures can be influenced?
Yeah, so
I think this is just, this is a toxic argument, and therefore, last point, people are shying away from even saying the word inequity. Because, well, they are, in this part of the country, big time.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid of that will cause anything they try to do to get pushback and stall at. It's happened 3 times in the last week with big foundations that shouldn't have these fears. But so I'm curious on how you make the rhetorical case based on your evidence.
Yeah, so I won't speak to what's happening here, or because I have no knowledge about that. But I will say that, again, it gets to the ethos of the foundation. So it's not about us. It's about the work of the portfolio. And because we express ourselves only through the work of the portfolio, so in the retreat itself, when you had 286 people together, entrepreneur after entrepreneur after entrepreneur spoke about their own life experience. And that's undeniable in terms of, that's not easily marginalized. That's not easily taken and put in a place where your life experience is because of some personal thing that you did or should have had happen to you. And the most powerful antidote to what you're saying, I think, but our experience is storytelling. It's just telling the stories of what people are doing, because they're undeniable. And they're only undeniable because they're incredibly authentic and true. And so true, authentic stories told are, and this gets to the arts and culture plea. What do the arts do? They help people tell stories. And often they tell stories about others and not about themselves. And if there's any hope we have, and I'm not sure there is, but let's hope there is, it's in the ability of humans to connect with each other through their own life experience and the life experience of others that they can see. There's a great article, by the way, and I'll try to remember where I just read it, but it's about the tension between pessimism and optimism. And it made a compelling case that it is so much easier to believe the world is ending than it is to believe the world is going to be okay. And that what we need are more optimists, because the social media's push and then human species, and this is again well beyond my pay grade, tend to want to land in conventional wisdom. And so this argument is that it's so much easier to be a pessimist because everybody's a pessimist around you. Whereas if you're the optimist, like, I actually don't believe that that's going to happen. You're left with very few facts and very few friends. So, for what it's worth, we are optimists.
Jim, are there any, I'm fascinated by the model that you've described. Are there any other comparable models, similar models that are doing it that way?
No.
How did you get 80 people to agree to put up, or institutions, I assume some of them institutions as well as individuals, to put up $1 million a year?
Yeah, so
perpetuity.
Right. So, well, it's not in perpetuity, and it started with Bill and Robin in 2002, and they had an incredibly successful run as venture capitalists. This is Bill Draper, who's 95 and is probably in the office as we speak, and his investment partner, Robin Richards Donahoe, who is incredible. I'm sad to say she's a Tar Heel, so can't really help it. But they started with their own capital in 2002 of $14 million, and then in 2010, Rob Kaplan joined them, and we raised a total of $33 million. And then in 2016, we closed our third fund at 65.7 million, and we have closed our fourth fund at north of 80 million. And again, it's the work. It is the work itself that is the whole reason why people support it. And, you know, it speaks for itself. Maybe it will forever, maybe it won't, but, you know, if we do our jobs and make an impact, and by the way, the other answer to the question why it doesn't exist, it's profoundly hard work, like really hard work. And it's never ending. And however hard it is for us, it's so much harder for our leaders. And, you know, my admonition to this panel I was on, which again felt very inside baseball, is like, hey, don't forget who's doing the work. It's not us, it's them. And make sure you're taking care of them. That is what matters. And that's what we try to keep in our brain. But it's really, 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 really hard. And it's personal.
Yeah. We have time for 3 more people if there's only 1 minute. So.
That's a 3-minute question or a 1-minute question.
We want people on Zoom to be able to hear it.
Yes, so I am intrigued by the pessimism, optimism, the sense of looking, rather than breaking systems down, which I'm sure that's needed as well, but the systems that are there are good, have holes in them. I'm curious if you could just drill in a little bit more on your experience in looking at where you see holes in systems or gaps or connections that need to occur, especially given all of the programs that you've invested in. Has there been some kind of common challenges, some common barriers that you've seen across them all? And or you can take this in 2 different directions. Has there been a point where you've learned something about a gap or a connection point where you've said, and here's where we're going to invest? Like there's been something that's just felt more attractive to you as a leverage place to
So
tackle.
within the broader category of gaps, so we see at least the areas that we care about, what I said earlier, which is a gap between a system that exists and the people it was designed to serve, and yet the persistence of people who were designed to be served who are not being served with a system that is still required to serve. And so we see that in education, we see that in healthcare, we see that in employment opportunities, we see that in criminal justice. It's kind of, once you sort of open your eyes to it, it's everywhere. Because there was a period of time when these systems were all created. And what happened is the systems didn't go away, but the populations they were intended to serve changed dramatically. For instance, one of the organizations in our portfolio is working with refugees, and refugees that are now in different communities. And our entrepreneur said to us, you know, how many languages do you think are spoken in a refugee camp? And, you know, a couple of people said, oh, 5, and somebody was brave and list 20, and they're like, no, it's about 80 to 100. And even within that, there are more dialects. And so when people are in a, quote, relief refugee camp, they don't even understand what's being asked of them. They lack the ability to communicate with the NGOs that are there for access to medical care, access to emergency care. And so this entity, so here we have a population in a specified place, so there's no question of where they are, with services that are available. And what is the problem? Language. And how do you solve for that? This organization has 2,000 volunteers with every language under the sun, available 24/7 across multiple time zones to be able to interpret in real time. And that is like, that's not technology. That's like just a simple solution to a very persistent problem. And that is like, when we saw that, it's like, wow, there's really lots of this stuff that can be solved for. And it's because we think of refugees as a homogeneous group, you know, misguided in our belief that they speak 2 languages and that the NGOs that are coming there obviously speak those 2 languages. It's so wildly complicated, but so solvable in so many ways.
We have a question on from one of our Zoom
Yep.
participants.
Zoom. How might philanthropy be uniquely positioned to advance racial equity?
Yeah, well, you've had a ton of speakers, I'm sure. I mean, again, it's this question of inequity. And the more that we can keep slugging away at it and creating equal opportunities at the very basics of life is the best way of it's not going to solve racial issues permanently, but again, the ability to provide access, the ability to provide opportunity, to your point, can help put a stab in that massive wall of hate.
Last question.
I have a small cube question, and it's the inverse of Tony's question, which is just a moment ago you were talking about how the work that you're supporting is really, really hard. How do you, with so much work to do, how do you sleep at night, and how do you help your entrepreneurs sustain their energy over time?
Yeah, so self-care is a real issue. Our entrepreneurs are definitely burning out at a higher level than ever before. I mean, well, I'll turn this question back to you. Like, I think we all have noticed something different has happened over 2 years. This accumulated weight on our shoulders, looking at a world of COVID, looking at a world of the potential of a tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, it's exhausting and it's agonizing, and there's not a lot of free space to allow you to recover. Now imagine you're in a conflict zone. You have all those issues. You have 1,000 other ones, and now you're trying to do something. So it's a big issue, and well, if we had Chatham House rules, I'd say something different. But so we try to remind everybody that as bad as it feels for you, it feels so much worse for the folks we're trying to help.
Right.
And like when you're feeling tired and when you're feeling, aggravated and frustrated, just remember who we're trying to help, and that should help you a lot.
Well, I can honestly say, Jim, that you have helped all of us a lot.
Oh, good.
An extraordinary session, grappling with some of the fundamental questions everybody in this room faces, and all of our peers elsewhere. I can't thank you enough for doing this. Before I recess our session, let me remind you that we have 2 more FIRG sessions in this semester. Allison Ranney, who is the managing partner of Koya Partners. Koya Partners is I think, predominantly female firm that focuses, it's a search firm that works for nonprofits and for for-profits, has a large number of people they found for leadership roles in those organizations, and especially people of color. And it's, she is, I wanted to bring her here because it's the only firm I know of that's specifically doing those things. And given the environments that we all know about, including here, it's important for us to know the record of somebody who can really make that happen. And so she will be here on November 2nd. And the next one is Antonia Hernandez, who is the head of the Los Angeles Community Foundation, large foundation, doing lots of work. She's been there, I think, for 20-some years, and I think doing a great job. I'll just tell you briefly, the spring semester, we have Carol Stern, the head of the Walton Family Foundation, Rip Rapson, whose name has been mentioned here, the Kresge Foundation for his biennial report, Ginny Esposito, is the founder of the National Center for Family Philanthropy. John Palfrey, the president of the MacArthur Foundation. And finally, Barbara Pickauer, who has been here before, is going to be doing the one solely Zoom session because she didn't want to travel because she had fractures. In any event, we will long remember this session. Jim, we will long remember you, and you may be elevated into the same role as Rick Rapson is.
Happy to come.
And come back again. But I just cannot overstate the significance of what I think we've all heard here today. And I think we'll go on thinking about it and thinking of those questions. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.